I think it'll be a good meeting. I really do believe that. Hopefully that'll be a good signal to the Russians, because they have been proactive, too, in wanting to get something done here. And I think that's what the president, that's who he is. He's a peace through strength president. The best wars are the wars that never have to get fought. And so if we can solve this and not fight anymore and save lives, that's the aim of President Trump.
OK, Steve Witkoff saying the Russians have been proactive on this as well. They have provided, of course, the Trump administration no details on what exactly Russia has been proactive on when it comes to these discussions. Meanwhile, EU leaders have met in Brussels to try to mobilise hundreds of billions in extra defence spending to counter the threat from Russia. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, who is there. Ollie, there may be some movement then on the Ukraine minerals deal, it seems.
Yeah, because, Tom, there's a major difference today versus last week, right, which is that now basically the United States has paused its military aid to Ukraine, has paused most of its intelligence gathering, sharing with Ukraine. And so they're really pushing that contract forward towards Zelensky once more, with those very sort of real differences in the sort of calculus. And that is something that obviously the president of Ukraine cannot ignore and is going to be forced increasingly to the table for, particularly in the fact that despite the fact that he was here in Brussels with EU leaders, there was nothing that sort of came in terms of more material support. There had been discussions about potentially another 20 billion euro package that sort of evaporated from the conclusions. And we got it very clearly from Mike Waltz speaking yesterday, saying that basically the move towards these negotiations and confidence building measures on the table, that would make the president take a hard look at removing the pause on weapons and intelligence sharing. That's directly linked basically to Ukraine's willingness to move quickly on these sort of the minerals deal, with explicitly a path towards a ceasefire. Of course, the Ukrainians have been resistant to do this without the sort of guarantees of ceasefire, the guarantees of security guarantees provided by the United States. That being said, the U.S., for its part, says that basically if you create economic vested interest by the U.S. in Ukraine, that sort of is a security guarantee. Of course, that ignores the fact that if, say, Russia were to reinvade Ukraine and take the territory, they could still honor the precious metals and then those sorts of contracts, which would really, if that's the only thing that it comes down to, wouldn't really be sufficient in giving the Ukrainians the kind of certainty and the kind of safety that they're anticipating. But of course, this is sort of the reality of basically turning the screws on the Ukrainians, pushing it forward. Zelensky, we understand, will meet with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, on Monday, and his team will hang back for a few days to discuss with the U.S. administration.
Ollie, meanwhile, in Brussels, you were at the event, of course, you were at the summit, you were following the discussions. The EU agreeing then to reform those fiscal rules to boost defence spending. Where are we in this process?
Yeah, so listen, let's look at what we actually got sort of materially. We mentioned that we expected potentially another 20 billion euros in terms of a defense package for Ukraine. That did not happen. There was a sort of there was a discussions about potentially putting forward one representative to help sort of negotiate on Europe's behalf. This was another thing that's been talked about for the last few years. That did not happen. What did happen was sort of moving forward on this idea of the fiscal rules. The EU says that this could unlock basically 650 billion euros over 4 years. We should say, though, that with these fiscal rules, a lot of these fiscal rules are also not necessarily followed by many European countries to begin with, right? They're often run afoul of them. And basically, just because you give the extra headroom to do more spending at the national level, basically allowing countries to acquire more debt, doesn't necessarily mean that they will do it, right? There's also other limits. There is, for example, the bond market. There's also fiscal strain within a nation. So that 650 billion euros is not necessarily, direct money. There's also this 150 billion euro loan that the EU has been talking about. They said that they're going to pick that up and examine it as a matter of great urgency. But again, in terms of the new money and the real sort of new money going towards defense, the main event this week was not out of the EU. It was out of Germany. It was out of Friedrich Merz. It was about that sort of basically trying to release the debt brake and get hundreds, if not close to €1 trillion worth of spending towards infrastructure and defense. And that is really going to be sort of setting the drumbeat for European defense. And of course, there is, of course, the question that they put out a statement with only 26 member states signing to it, Hungary being notably absent throughout this whole process in terms of endorsing Ukraine and military aid there.